Imagine you're 18 years old. Not the confident, gym-toned 18-year-old you see in recruitment posters today, but the 18 of 1776, 5'6" on a good day, weighing maybe 130 pounds, with teeth in questionable condition, and a diet that's been 60% cornmeal since birth. And now someone hands you a flintlock musket that weighs nearly as much as a newborn calf, pats you on the shoulder, and says, "Congratulations, son, you're going to fight the British Empire." Sounds heroic, doesn't it? Except no one mentioned that your new uniform might be your everyday farm clothes. Your shoes may have holes, and the word breakfast is about to become more of a nostalgic memory than a daily event. The Continental Army, George Washington's army, was a patchwork of farmers, apprentices, shopkeepers, and the occasional runaway. Few had any formal military training. Most had never fired a musket in their lives. And those who had were usually so short on gunpowder that they weren't allowed to practice anyway. Here's the unromantic truth. By the time you actually saw battle, you'd be lucky if you'd had a week's worth of drilling. And drilling meant learning to march in a straight line, stand still in the cold, and, most importantly, not accidentally stab the man in front of you with your bayonet. But the real shock came in your first weeks of service. You learned quickly that being a Continental soldier wasn't just about dodging British bullets. It was about surviving everything else: hunger, disease, frostbite, and a military hierarchy that often treated you as expendable. The pay, almost mythical. Congress promised you $6 a month, but sometimes it never arrived at all. And even if it did, you might have to spend it immediately on food because the army rations were, well, let's say aspirational. In your first month, you'd likely meet men who hadn't been issued shoes in over a year. You'd watch friends fall sick from smallpox or dysentery before they ever faced the enemy. You'd hear the distant sound of cannon fire and realize, with a pit in your stomach, that soon you'd be standing in front of it. By then, you'd understand the truth your recruiter didn't tell you. The hardest part of surviving as a Continental soldier wasn't fighting the British. It was surviving the Continental Army itself. And here's the thing, you might think you're ready to prove yourself. But by the end of your first winter, you'd know why most didn't survive the full term of their enlistment, and why the ones who did were never quite the same. Suppose you had made it through the nerve-wracking enlistment and the awkward farewell to your family. In that case, you'd soon discover that the reality of being a Continental soldier was far from the heroic image painted by recruiting officers. The very first shock, the food, or rather, the idea of food. In theory, you were supposed to get a daily ration, a pound of bread, a pound of beef or salted pork, a gill of peas or beans, and a bit of rum to wash it all down. In practice, you might go 2 or 3 days without meat. Bread could arrive hard enough to chip a tooth, and the salted pork was often so rancid it had to be boiled 3 times before it was remotely edible. If you were unlucky enough to be stationed near the end of a long supply line, the meals grew even stranger. Men boiled leather from old shoes to soften it enough to chew, scraped bark from trees to make broth, or gnawed on raw flour dough because it was all they had. Sleeping arrangements were another rude awakening. Your bed was often just the ground, perhaps with a thin blanket if you were lucky. In summer, this meant nights spent swatting away mosquitoes and trying to ignore the damp. In winter, it meant frostbitten fingers and the terrifying knowledge that some of your fellow soldiers wouldn't wake up come morning. A few men huddled together for warmth, but the cold still crept in, gnawing at your bones like an unrelenting thief. And the discipline, oh, the discipline. The Continental Army had borrowed much of its structure from European militaries, especially the Prussian model. That meant rules were strict, punishments were brutal, and officers rarely showed leniency. Being late for roll call might earn you a few hours of extra duty. Falling asleep while on sentry duty could earn you a whipping, or worse. Desertion. That was a hanging offense. And the army made sure the rest of the men were present to watch, as a grim reminder. The smell of camp was something no civilian could have prepared you for. Picture a crowded village of men who had not bathed in weeks, mixed with the smoke of wood fires, the sharp scent of gunpowder, and the sour odor of spoiled rations. Add to that the stench of open latrines, which were rarely dug far enough from camp to make a difference, and you begin to understand why disease killed more soldiers than bullets. Smallpox, dysentery, and typhus spread like wildfire in such close quarters. If you fell ill, the so-called hospital might be nothing more than a cold tent where the sick lay side by side, moaning in pain, with only a handful of overworked surgeons to tend to them. And yet, there was also a strange, unshakable sense of camaraderie. You were part of something larger now, bound to these ragged men by shared hardship. The campfires became places of whispered stories, crude jokes, and the quiet strumming of a fiddle brought from home. The laughter was often dark, but it was a lifeline. You could hate the army, hate the rations, hate the endless drilling, but in those moments, you would catch yourself feeling that maybe, just maybe, you belonged. You hadn't faced your first real battle yet, but already, you were learning the first truth of life as a Continental soldier. The enemy was not always the red-coated British across the field. Sometimes, the enemy was hunger. Sometimes, it was disease. And sometimes, it was your own body, wearing down under the weight of cold, fatigue, and fear. And yet, morning would come. The drum would sound, and you'd rise, stiff, sore, and still determined to march on. By now, you've been marching for hours. Your shoulders ache from the musket digging into them, your legs burn, and your feet throb inside stiff leather shoes that are already rubbing blisters raw. You try not to think about the fact that the sun has barely reached its highest point, and there's still a long way to go before camp. Hunger gnaws at you. The Continental Army's rations were never generous, and in many cases, they were barely edible. The official daily ration for a soldier was supposed to be about a pound of beef or fish, a pound of bread or flour, and a gill of rum. But in reality, supply shortages meant you might get only a chunk of hardtack, rock-hard biscuits so dense that soldiers sometimes had to break them with the butt of their muskets. If the biscuits were too tough to bite, you'd soak them in water, or rum, if you were lucky, just to avoid breaking a tooth. Sometimes, the food was worse than none at all. Meat could be rancid, flour infested with weevils. Soldiers joked, grimly, that at least the bugs added extra protein. But when you're starving, humor is the only seasoning you've got. Water wasn't any easier to come by. On long marches, you might have to drink from streams or puddles, knowing full well the water was unsafe. Dysentery, violent diarrhea, spread through camps like wildfire, and it was often deadlier than musket balls. Dehydration could set in quickly during summer campaigns, but you kept moving because slowing down meant falling behind. And falling behind could mean never catching up. The officers urged discipline. But discipline is hard to keep when your stomach cramps and your lips crack from thirst. Still, there was always one thing keeping you going, the knowledge that your struggle might actually mean something. You weren't just marching for yourself. You were part of a rebellion, a cause that might give future generations freedom. The march would sometimes last from dawn until dusk, and there was no guarantee that a rest meant you'd actually get to sit. Stopping in open country made you an easy target for enemy scouts, so you'd often stay in motion until a secure campsite was found. And when you did finally stop, there was no soft bed waiting. You'd drop your gear, rub your aching shoulders, and start the next task, digging latrines, pitching tents, if you had one, or building crude shelters from branches. All before you could even think about eating. That's when you'd realize the day's work wasn't over. It was just shifting into a different kind of misery. Tomorrow, you'd do it all over again. And again, and again, until winter came, when things somehow got even worse. If there was one thing that could make a man truly hate his boots, it was the march. The Continental Army marched endlessly, through snow that cut into their legs like knives, through summer heat that wrapped around their bodies like a wet blanket, through ankle-deep mud that tried to swallow them whole. A soldier could walk 20 miles in a day, sleep for 3 hours, and then do it all over again. There were no comfortable wagons for low-ranking men. If you were a private, you carried everything you owned on your back: your musket, powder horn, cartridge box, blanket, tin cup, maybe a small bag of flour or dried peas if you were lucky. Some men carried cooking pots slung from their belts, clanking with every step. Others tied spare clothes, or what passed for spare clothes, into bundles that dug into their shoulders. The march was a test of willpower more than strength. Roads were rare, more often. The path was little more than a rough trail or open field. Streams had to be crossed without bridges, hills climbed without switchbacks, and thick forests hacked through with axes. If it rained, the water seeped into every seam of your clothing until you were soaked to the skin. If it snowed, your feet went numb, and frostbite became a constant threat. The British, with their disciplined red-coated regiments and supply trains, might have seemed like they had it easier. But even they looked at the ragged Americans and thought, these men will never last. And yet, somehow, they did. There were moments of brief reprieve, singing marching songs, swapping stories, teasing the green recruits. Some soldiers carved walking sticks to lean on during long days. Others tied bits of leather or cloth around their boots to patch holes, using whatever they could scavenge. But the hardest part of the march wasn't the weight or the weather. It was the silence. Hours could pass with nothing but the sound of feet pounding dirt, the creak of leather straps, and the faint rattle of muskets against belts. And in that silence, a soldier's mind wandered, to the farm he'd left behind, the family he might never see again, or the very real possibility that the next battle could be his last. Marching wasn't just about getting from one place to another. It was a slow grinding down of the body and the spirit. And for many low-ranking soldiers, the march was when the thought first crept in, I might not survive this war. The marching never really stopped. Dawn was just a suggestion on the horizon when the officers barked orders to form ranks, and the sound of drums, not breakfast bells, signaled the day's beginning. The Continental soldier would shoulder his musket, sling his cartridge box, and take his place in the long, uneven line. Food was a problem, and not the kind you could solve with a quick stop at a tavern. Supply wagons were often days late, if they arrived at all. Men were expected to march 15 or even 20 miles on empty stomachs, the only meal being a chunk of hardtack so dense it could crack a tooth. Some softened it in water or broth, others joked it was better used as a plate. Salt pork, when it appeared, came in slabs so tough and salty it could make a man thirstier than before he ate it. Thirst was worse than hunger. A summer march in wool meant rivers of sweat pouring from under cocked hats and down dusty cheeks. The canteens emptied fast. Water from streams had to be drunk quickly or boiled, and boiling meant stopping, which wasn't always possible. Many drank from muddy puddles or animal troughs, knowing full well they might pay for it with sickness later. Feet blistered and bled inside worn shoes, if the soldier was lucky enough to still have them. Some trudged barefoot, the soles of their feet toughened like leather. Every mile was measured not in distance, but in pain, each step another reminder of how far from home they were. The road itself was an enemy. It was not the smooth, straight path you might imagine, but a twisting, rutted scar through wilderness and farmland. Mud in the spring could swallow a man to his knees. Dust in the summer clung to everything, filling nostrils and coating lips until even water tasted like dirt. Yet the march was more than suffering. It was also a moving campfire of voices. Men sang to keep time, swapped stories to distract from the ache, and sometimes just walked in silence, each lost in his own thoughts, of the farm left untended, the sweetheart left waiting, or the gnawing question of whether any of this would even work. And still, they marched, because turning back was unthinkable, because the cause, however distant and abstract it might feel on an empty stomach, was worth more than rest. And because, in the strange rhythm of those endless roads, a soldier could almost forget that the real battle still lay ahead. Imagine waking before the sun even dares to rise. The air is black and sharp, the kind of cold that bites into your fingers and makes you fumble with the buttons of your worn coat. Your boots are still damp from yesterday, because they are always damp, and when you pull them on, the leather feels stiff as frozen bark. There is no breakfast waiting in a warm kitchen. Instead, you chew a bit of hardtack, its edges so sharp it could almost cut your gums. You wash it down with a swallow of tepid water from your canteen, knowing you'll need to ration the rest. The order comes, march. The Continental Army doesn't travel in comfort. It's not a steady, smooth stroll. It's a ragged, halting procession over roads that aren't really roads at all. Some days, you slog through mud so deep that it swallows your shoes. Other days, the snow crunches underfoot and soaks your socks until your toes feel like stones. Your rifle is heavy. Your pack is heavier. It holds everything you own, a spare shirt, maybe an extra pair of stockings if you're lucky, your blanket, and whatever food you've managed to keep. But the load never feels lighter, no matter how many miles you've covered. And the miles, they are endless. 10 miles today, 15 tomorrow. The commanders push on, driven by rumors of enemy movement or the need to meet up with reinforcements. But to you, the soldier, the landscape is just an endless blur, fields, forests, streams, and the occasional farmhouse that stares at you with shuttered windows, as if the land itself has gone into hiding. You begin to notice something odd. Soldiers stop talking as the day wears on. The jokes from the morning fade into silence, replaced by the sound of labored breathing and boots dragging through dirt. A man near you limps with every step, his shoe worn through until his bare heel bleeds. No one says anything, because everyone's feet are bleeding. Sometimes the march is made worse by weather that seems determined to test you. A sudden downpour turns the trail into a brown river. A cold wind cuts through every layer of your clothing and makes your fingers too numb to hold your musket properly. And yet, you keep moving. Not because you're eager, but because stopping means falling behind. And falling behind means risking being left behind. The cruelest part is that you never truly know where you're going. The officers might tell you the next encampment is just a few more miles. But those few miles stretch until your knees ache and your vision narrows. You begin to dream of the moment you can sit down, not even sleep, just sit, and take the weight off your legs. By nightfall, you finally reach the day's end. There is no fanfare, no tents neatly waiting for you. You drop your pack, lean your musket against a tree, and collapse onto the ground, which might be frozen, or muddy, or crawling with insects depending on the season. You pull your blanket over you, your body trembling from the sudden stillness. And as you close your eyes, your last thought isn't about victory or glory. It's simply this: tomorrow, I will have to get up and do it all again. By the winter of 1777, you would have already been hardened by months of marching, sleepless nights, and short rations. But Valley Forge was something different entirely. It was not a battlefield. It was not a siege. It was a slow, grinding test of endurance, one that would claim more soldiers than many of the actual battles in the war. You arrive in December, boots worn to paper-thin leather, or perhaps gone altogether, your feet wrapped in strips of cloth. The ground is frozen hard, and the wind cuts through your coat like knives. Your orders are simple: build shelter. But there is no lumberyard waiting for you, just the frozen forest and your own numb fingers. Men fell trees, dragged the logs, and stacked them into crude huts. No nails, no glass windows, just mud, sticks, and the hope they'll hold against the wind. The floors are dirt, sometimes covered with straw. At night, you lie so close to the other men that you can hear their teeth chatter in the dark. Food becomes an obsession. A standard ration was supposed to be a pound of beef, bread, and a bit of peas or beans. At Valley Forge, days pass without meat. Bread, when it comes, is often moldy. You learn to boil old leather for soup, to gnaw on bark, to drink weak broth made from whatever roots could be dug from the frozen earth. And the sickness, it is everywhere. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery. Some men are too weak to rise from their bunks. Others collapse while carrying water from the Schuylkill River, never to get up again. The smell inside the huts grows foul, a mix of unwashed bodies, smoke, and sickness. You might think soldiers at Valley Forge fought against the British that winter, but the truth is, they fought against death itself. More than 2,000 would not survive to see spring. And yet, not all was despair. Somehow, amid the suffering, something began to change. General Washington worked tirelessly to improve the army's supplies. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer with a sharp tongue and a gift for drilling men into shape, began training the soldiers in new, disciplined formations. You start to march differently. Your musket feels more natural in your hands. You can reload faster, stand straighter, and fire in volleys that sound like thunder. You begin to believe that maybe, just maybe, the Continental Army will last long enough to win. But make no mistake, if you had been there that winter, the odds were grim. Many who lived through it never forgot the sight of a comrade's bare, frost-bitten feet, or the sound of another man's final cough in the cold dark. Surviving Valley Forge wasn't just about bravery. It was about endurance, about pushing through each day when your body was screaming to give up. And if you could survive that, the rest of the war might almost seem easy. If you had somehow survived the hunger, the cold, and the endless drills, there was still one more enemy you couldn't shoot at: disease. Smallpox, dysentery, typhus, pneumonia. These were the silent killers of the Continental Army. They crept into tents and huts like thieves, striking without warning. The camp at Morristown, the winter of 1779 to 1780, became known as the coldest winter in memory. It wasn't just the frostbite that claimed lives. It was the sickness that came with overcrowded shelters and filthy conditions. Men coughed themselves hoarse in the night. The latrine pits froze solid, so waste piled up dangerously close to sleeping quarters. Rats thrived. The sick list often rivaled, or even outnumbered, the muster roll. You could be alive but unable to stand, much less hold a musket. Hospitals were makeshift, usually just barns or commandeered houses, and there were rarely enough trained doctors to tend to the sick. The few surgeons in camp worked with primitive tools and a pitiful supply of medicine: willow bark for pain, vinegar for disinfecting wounds, maybe molasses for energy. And if you caught smallpox, you were in real trouble. At the time, inoculation existed, but it was dangerous and controversial. Washington himself took the bold step of ordering mass inoculations for the army, not out of kindness, but because the disease was wiping out entire companies. If you survived the crude procedure and the fever that followed, you were considered lucky. Many soldiers didn't even live long enough to see combat. They died in their blankets, surrounded by their equally shivering, equally desperate comrades. Those who recovered often returned to the line thinner, weaker, and with a hollow look in their eyes. They had beaten disease, yes, but at a steep cost. The truth was becoming clear. In the Continental Army, your greatest battle wasn't always against the British. It was against the invisible enemies in your own camp. Survival in the Continental Army was as much about food as it was about bullets. Despite their fierce determination, the soldiers often found themselves starving, not because of enemy action but due to a woefully inadequate supply system. Roads were poor, wagons broke down, and supplies sent from distant farms or towns sometimes never arrived. Sometimes, the only food a soldier could find was whatever he could scavenge or barter for along the way. Hardtack was a staple, but it was more like a weapon than nourishment, so dense and dry it could shatter teeth. Salt pork was heavily salted and greasy, often riddled with worms, but still devoured out of sheer hunger. Fresh fruits, vegetables, and grains were luxuries almost unheard of during campaigns. Soldiers learned to adapt, cooking meals over open fires with whatever they could find: roots, wild game, even tree bark boiled into a bitter stew. The struggle for food turned men into scavengers, bargaining for scraps from local farmers or foraging in the wilderness, sometimes at the risk of running afoul of angry civilians. Hunger was more than physical pain. It gnawed at morale, creating tension within ranks. Fights over rations broke out in camp, and desertion rates climbed when the hunger grew unbearable. Officers struggled to keep discipline when empty stomachs made men desperate. Despite the hardship, the army marched on. For many, each bite of hardtack or sip of thin broth was a small victory, a reminder that they were still alive, still fighting for a cause that seemed, at times, almost impossible. If the relentless march and starvation weren't enough, the true test for a continental soldier was the battlefield itself. Battles weren't neat affairs. They were brutal, chaotic, and terrifying beyond anything you'd imagined as you sat freezing in camp or trudged across muddy roads. Smoke choked the air. Muskets cracked like thunder, and the screams of wounded men echoed across fields and forests. You stood shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, heart pounding, eyes scanning for movement. When the order came, you fired in volleys, but often you never saw the enemy until they were almost on top of you. Bayonets flashed. Men grappled in close quarters, the clash of steel ringing in your ears. Wounds were gruesome and common. Limbs shattered by musket balls. Flesh torn by cannon shrapnel. The screams of pain were constant. There was no mercy on the battlefield, only survival. Amidst the carnage, fear was your constant companion. Not just fear of death, but fear of pain, fear of the unknown, fear of leaving your family behind. Some men froze in terror. Others fought with a desperate fury, driven by the hope that if they could just survive one more minute, they might see another day. After the battle, the horrors continued. The wounded cried out for help, many left unattended on the field for hours. Bodies were gathered for burial, often in mass graves. Disease and infection claimed as many lives as enemy fire. For the low-ranking soldier, battle was a crucible that tested every ounce of courage and willpower. Many didn't survive. Many more survived, but with scars, physical and mental, that would never fully heal. War was not only a battle of muskets and cannons, but a war fought deep within the minds of the soldiers themselves. After the guns fell silent and the blood dried on the fields, many soldiers faced an enemy no one could see, a lingering shadow that followed them home, haunting their dreams and waking hours alike. Nightmares of battle scenes, screams, and comrades dying in agony tore through sleep, leaving men exhausted and trembling. Some soldiers became withdrawn, their eyes vacant, unable to speak of what they had witnessed. Others erupted in anger or sudden tears, struggling with feelings they couldn't explain or control. In an era long before the term post-traumatic stress disorder existed, these reactions were often misunderstood. Some were labeled cowards or shell-shocked, while others quietly suffered in silence, afraid to show weakness. Letters home, when they could be written, tried to mask the horrors endured. Soldiers wrote of camaraderie and patriotism, but behind the words was a deep well of sorrow and fear. The loss of friends, the uncertainty of survival, and the constant march toward another fight weighed heavily on every man. Some found solace in small rituals, prayers whispered in the cold, songs sung softly around campfires, or letters kept close like talismans. Others turned to alcohol or fleeting moments of joy to escape the relentless grip of war's psychological wounds. Despite this invisible battle, many continued to stand and fight. Their strength was not just in their rifles or discipline, but in sheer resilience, the will to survive day after day, against all odds. Surviving the Continental Army wasn't just about living through battles or harsh winters. It was about enduring the unthinkable and still standing when the smoke cleared. Many soldiers who made it through the war returned home forever changed. Their bodies bore scars from musket balls and frostbite. Their minds carried memories no one else could understand. Yet, they carried with them a fierce pride, the knowledge that they had helped forge a new nation. For these men, survival was an act of rebellion against impossible odds. They had endured hunger, sickness, and terror. They had faced death on muddy battlefields and in freezing camps. They had marched for miles with little rest, their spirits tested daily. Their sacrifices laid the foundation for the United States, yet many returned to lives of poverty, struggling to find work or recognition. Some veterans formed early organizations to support each other, precursors to modern veteran groups, understanding that survival extended beyond the battlefield. The question, could you survive as a Continental soldier, isn't just about physical endurance. It's about courage, resilience, and an unyielding hope. It's about ordinary men becoming extraordinary through hardship. And while most didn't survive the war itself, their legacy endures in the freedom and country they helped create.